Good evening, guys. All right, we're going to do the last video for chapter 12 here, talking about Reconstruction. If you think back to the last video, what we talked about was that there were a lot of difference of opinions when it came down to how Reconstruction should be handled. That now that the Civil War is over with, how do we reunite the country? And if you think back to the last time we talked about, Abraham Lincoln had his plan, which was very lenient. Again, Lincoln's plan the entire way here is that he wanted to reunite the country. And now that the war is finally over, or at least it's coming to an end and then over, Lincoln wants a very smooth, somewhat coming back together, a reunification. He did not want to throw it into the face of the Southerners. Now, he certainly wanted some people to pay, and he believed that it was the leadership of the Confederacy. He believed that it was individuals that were responsible for what happened, and not just Southerners in general. So he wanted to pardon most of the Confederate soldiers, and really only punish the leaders. However, Lincoln is assassinated, and Vice President Andrew Johnson is made president as a result. And Johnson has a very similar plan to what Lincoln wanted. Johnson also wanted to be very lenient in regards to Reconstruction, to not necessarily have a lot of things that they had to do to be readmitted into the Union. However, if you think back, then there was a lot of conflicts in between both Lincoln and Congress, and then Johnson and Congress, because you had different groups within Congress called the Radical Republicans that wanted the South to really pay for the war. Okay, they saw this as in the Southern states, and the Southern people really needed to pay for the atrocities of the Civil War. And so there's a lot of going back and forth here. Even before Lincoln is assassinated, there were a lot of disagreements in between Lincoln and Congress. Lincoln vetoes the Wade Davis bill just before he is assassinated. And then you have the same thing happening in between Johnson and Congress, where Johnson vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau Act, as well as Congress's suggestion for Reconstruction. Matter of fact, Congress tries to, they impeach Johnson. Things get that far out of hand. And when it comes down to it, the radicals and the moderate Republicans in Congress are going to have too much of a political power. Okay, they're going to be able to override Johnson's vetoes, and therefore the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is put into place. And this Reconstruction is really going to be very, very terrible. And we started talking about this the other night, and we're going to finish this up tonight and talking about Reconstruction in the South. So that's what we're focusing on now. Congressional Reconstruction has now started, and you have a lot of things that happen as a result. Now, if you think back to what we talked about, you have different groups that are in the South during Reconstruction. First of all, the South is divided into 5 different military districts. Instead of each state pretty much governing itself, the entire South is divided into 5 different sections. Each section or district is going to be headed up by a Union general. So again, 2, 3, 4 years after the war is over, the South is having to relive losing this war because you have a Union general that's pretty much running the show. You pretty much have what's called martial law here. Where it's not left up to individual states to run their state. It's not like state government versus the United States government. You now have a middleman, which is the Army. The Army plays a very, very big role here. And really in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, really in about a 30 or 40-year period here since the Civil War, you have something that we haven't had in a long time, and that is the military plays a very large role in regards to making sure that the law is followed and enforcing the law. And that is certainly the case during Reconstruction. You have groups called scalawags and carpetbaggers that are taking advantage of the things that are happening in the South. Southern people are getting taken advantage of it. And I'm not just saying that because we are in the South, but when you look down on it, then Reconstruction really was not handled very well. And so many Southerners, instead of this being a healing process and a rebuilding of the United States, many Southerners are going to remain even more divided as they were before because of how all this is going down. you have one group in particular that's formed called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK as we call it, is going to be formed in the winter of 1865 going into 1866. Now, as we talk about this over the next few minutes, I want you to understand one thing. The Ku Klux Klan here in 1865 is different than what we see the Ku Klux Klan today. Okay, most everybody in the United States today knows what the KKK is, what they stand for. I'll be flat out honest, a bunch of ignorant people, and I don't mind saying that. People who do some of the worst, inhumane things ever. That organization should never be allowed to be in the United States at this point. That being said, this first installment, or when the Ku Klux Klan was originally formed, it wasn't the same thing as they are today. Okay, the first version of the Ku Klux Klan was designed to basically combat Reconstruction. That's entirely what it was about. It was to fight back against these Northern generals that were in control of these military districts. They were there to fight off carpetbaggers and scalawags and dirty politicians, and that's exactly what it was designed to be. It was more or less like a protest group. It was originally started, believe it or not, in Pulaski, Tennessee, only about 45 minutes away from here is where the KKK started, and it was started by 6 former Confederate soldiers. Now, these Confederate soldiers, just like today, they really didn't. It was very secretive. Okay, there were in some cases where they did not want their faces to be shown, but it wasn't like it is today, to where it's a racial organization. Back to this time period, it was to basically be a way of fighting back against Northern control of the Southern states. But now it very quickly turns into something different. Okay, it doesn't take very long at all before the Ku Klux Klan ends up turning into what it is today, and that happens as new chapters of the KKK are formed. Okay, you have the original chapter, or the original group of men whose primary goal here is to fight back against Reconstruction. It's to fight back against Northerners. It's to protest and to try to run these scalawags and these carpetbaggers out of town. And as new organizations of the KKK get started in other towns and cities in the South, what you have is that's where a lot of this racial discrimination begins. In that it quickly turns into more of a radical organization in regards to targeting race. Specifically black men, and it's for a variety of reasons. It's because of the traditional mindset of whites are better than blacks, or that's the mindset that they had, not that I had. There is an aspect here that they keep in mind that that slavery is now abolished, and what you have here is that black men are now competing for jobs that used to be controlled by white men, and so there is an aspect there as well of trying to what they call protecting jobs, trying to keep black men from voting. Keep in mind that with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, black men are now allowed to vote, and their voting could in turn lead to candidates that normal Southerners might not have supported before. And so these new chapters of the KKK, or what I call the second installment, or the second version of the KKK, is going to be more tiered, not only against Reconstruction, but also against black men, black women, as well as certain white people as well. And again, it's not necessarily the same thing that it's going to turn into later on, but it's definitely getting towards that direction. Matter of fact, in 1869, things get so out of control that the KKK is disbanded. And it's done so by a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, let me talk just a few minutes about Nathan Bedford Forrest, because Forrest is one of the most controversial figures in American history, and in some cases for a very good reason. We've already talked about him in the Civil War. We talked about the Fort Pillow Massacre, which many blame General Forrest for, because he was in control of those men. And many people like to take that into Nathan Bedford Forrest. That's just who he was. As we get into Forrest after the Civil War, then we see maybe a different version of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And what I'm about to tell you comes off of a lot of research that I've done. I try to do a lot of non-biased research. If something that I say is untrue, please point it out to me, and I'll do the best I can to correct it. but this is based off of actual research that I've done, that after the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest actually becomes somewhat of a proponent of civil rights, believe it or not. His hometown is Memphis, Tennessee, and there was clear historical evidence that he did a lot of good for some things in civil rights. Surely not as far as it should have gone, but actually was a proponent for some civil rights groups. As a matter of fact, what was called the Pole Bearers Club, which was kind of the early version of the NAACP. The Pole Bearers Club will actually invite Nathan Bedford Forrest to speak at one of their meetings. And so Nathan Bedford Forrest was not necessarily this man who for the rest of his life sought to terrorize black men and women. He was kind of the opposite, actually. Now, that being said, there's a lot of misconception in regards to Nathan Bedford Forrest and his role in the KKK. As a matter of fact, I noticed on your study guide, as I was looking over it a couple of days ago, that one of the questions on there was who was the first Grand Wizard of the KKK, and what you probably would have written down is Nathan Bedford Forrest. I did not realize that that's actually an old study guide. That in the last 2 years of doing more research, there is not any kind of proof whatsoever that Nathan Bedford Forrest was not the first Grand Wizard. Okay, matter of fact, there's evidence to suggest otherwise. It is proven that he was in the KKK, and as the story goes, one of those 6 original Confederates that started the organization is going to recruit Nathan Bedford Forrest because of his prestigious reputation as a Southerner, and Nathan Bedford Forrest does join. However, he is not part of this whole terrorizing black men, women, and children aspect to the KKK. Matter of fact, when all that starts to happen, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is believed that he does at one point does become Grand Wizard, we don't know for sure. We do know that he was offered the position of Grand Wizard, which means that he is head over the entire KKK organization. We don't know whether or not he accepted it. He probably did. Whether or not he was the first Grand Wizard, we don't know. We just don't have any proof of that. He was certainly not one of the founding members. That is for sure. Nathan Bedford Forrest was not one of the founding members of the KKK. Probably the first Grand Wizard, but was not in favor of this whole terrorist organization, especially in regards to minorities. And in 1869, Nathan Bedford Forrest is actually going to order the KKK to be disbanded because they've gotten out of control. They've gone from being an organization that was designed to run Northerners out of the South into an organization that's pretty much like a terrorist organization like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that's not what the organization was supposed to be to begin with. So Nathan Bedford Forrest will actually shut down the KKK in 1869. Now, later on in the 1920s and 1930s, we get the third installment or the third version of the KKK. And that version is the version that we now know of today. A racially motivated organization, white supremacist. Again, that organization needs to go away forever and never come back. And again, I'm not afraid to say that. Should never had been existed to begin with. But there are 3 different versions of the Ku Klux Klan here. The original one that was designed to just run Northerners out of the South because of Reconstruction. The second one that was formed out of the new chapters that are going to start targeting black men, women, and children. And then the third version in the 1920s and 30s, which is the version that we now think of today. So I want to take a few minutes just to explain that because, after all, we are living in the South. We are living in Alabama. And as you talk about the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, we are at the forefront of the civil rights movement, and not for the right reasons. So we haven't had a very good history in regards to these types of things. So I did want to make sure that I explain that. Again, if anything that I said is inaccurate, please bring me some hardcore evidence and I will change it. However, that is based off of my research. Getting back to Reconstruction, to kind of see what's happening here, in that Southerners are starting to fight back because of Northerners taking advantage, as well as Southern politicians as well. It's not all Northerners. You have Southern politicians that's out to gain power and wealth. And so a lot of groups here who are taking advantage of the situation. But what happens here is that people are going to begin to fight back. And so that's what leads to the formation of the KKK to begin with. Now, as we get to the 1870s, several things are going to happen. First of all, the Freedmen's Bureau Act is going to expire in 1872. Keep in mind that the Freedmen's Bureau was designed to help black men and women transition into a newly freed life. That organization is going to not exist anymore as of 1872. Many of these organizations and many of these programs that were designed to help rebuild the South never really happens. As a matter of fact, when Reconstruction is all said and done, the South is not rebuilt at all. You have projects that are begun but not finished. You have buildings and bridges and railroads that have been started but that are pretty much abandoned. And instead, what's going to happen is that the South is going to have to, over the next several decades, rebuild themselves. Now that the Civil War is over with, you now have a new political war going on between the South and the North over the idea of Reconstruction and how Reconstruction is handled. You do have the Democrats gaining power once again, especially in the South. Now, again, I want to point out here that the Democrat and Republican Party in the 1860s is very different than the Democrat and Republican parties of 2020. Okay. I've heard a lot of people say that back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Alabama was mostly Democrat at that point in time. Well, the two parties have changed values a good bit to where that's why we are now a mostly Republican state. The values haven't changed a whole lot. It's just that the parties have. And so don't think that the Republican and Democrat Party of the 1860s is the same thing as today. Okay, yes, they are the same parties. But their values have changed a lot over the years. So you can't always go off of that. But you do have the Democrat Party that is gaining more and more power in the South because of what's going on. And as far as Grant's presidency, because Ulysses Grant was elected president in 1868. I'm sorry, 1868. His presidency does not go as well as it should be. Okay. Again, Grant was a Civil War hero. He was the hero of the Civil War. And so, yes, he's going to win the presidential election. However, his presidency is filled with nothing but scandals. First of all, Grant himself, it was very well known that he was a drunk. Even during the Civil War, he was a drunk. And so that really doesn't change much as president. Grant also has a lot of men around him in his administration that are really not experienced at all. And that are using this opportunity to only gain their own power and their own wealth. And so as a result, you have a lot of scandals, a lot of backdoor deals, a lot of fraudulent activity that's being done. Not necessarily by Grant himself, but by those that were under his administration. And so Grant will win re-election in 1872. But over the next 3 or 4 years, Grant's administration is really going to be nothing but bribery, scandals, all this kind of stuff, to the point to where in 1876, Grant does not run for re-election. We're talking about a time period here to where there are no term limits yet. That doesn't come until the 1940s and 1950s after Franklin Roosevelt. So Grant could have run for a third term here, but he knows that he's not going to win. Okay, his entire presidency is nothing but scandals, briberies, all that kind of stuff, to the point of where he knows that he doesn't need to run again. And so in 1876, Grant's presidency is going to come to an end. And that's why Ulysses Grant, his presidency, is seen as one of the worst in American history because of how Reconstruction was handled, because of the bribery and scandals, because of his own reputation. Grant is deemed as one of the worst presidents in American history. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe that's really unfair, but that's pretty much how it's seen. So as we go through the 1870s and we get into the heart of Reconstruction, what's going to happen in that things are going to go from bad to worse. Okay, you're going to have an economic depression taking place in the South. Again, when it comes down to it, the South after the Civil War is in really, really bad shape. Okay, again, it's bad enough to lose your war for independence, but what happens over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years is that economically you're going right downhill. Okay, really, your problems are only beginning when you lose the war. Because after that, you have to rebuild physically. You have to rebuild towns and cities and buildings and railroads and bridges. and farmland and all that kind of stuff. And economically, things go from bad to worse. And so you just want to talk about a time period that's just downright crappy for the South. This is it. Okay. From the end of the Civil War into for the next several decades. Again, it's going to take until the 1900s until the South fully recovers from the economic devastation of the Civil War. And Reconstruction is going to make that worse. Okay, you have a 5-year depression that takes place in the 1870s. You have not only in the South, but really in the United States as a whole. The largest banking firm in the United States is going to go bankrupt. Smaller banks will also go bankrupt. They will close down. The stock market is going to collapse. And in 1873, the United States goes into a depression. Okay, the Great Depression was not the only time in our history to where we've had an economic depression. Again, how this goes is that if you have 6 straight months of economic downturn, which means that things are going downhill, that's called a recession. If it stays for 6 more months, or rather a whole year, or rather is looking like that for a whole year, then that's what's called an economic depression. I anticipate that here in the United States that because of COVID-19, I think that we're headed straight for a recession. You would talk about the unemployment rate right now, and businesses being not only closed down for temporarily, but some businesses have completely shut their doors. Look at places like Logan's that will never reopen, and a lot of that has to do with COVID-19. And so I fully think that we're headed towards an economic recession. Because the economy has taken such a big hit at this point, it's going to take a lot to get it back up. And that's exactly what's happening here in the 1870s after the Civil War, is that the economy for the entire United States is now going downhill. So if the economy for the North is going downhill, imagine what the economy for the South is now doing. And so you have political violence that's going to continue in the South. Excuse me. You have atrocities in regards to black men and women. Former slaves are going to be denied civil and political rights. You have what's called black codes and Jim Crow laws, which are going to be pretty much loopholes to keep black men from going to vote. Keep in mind yet that women can't vote yet. Okay, white or black women cannot vote yet. That won't happen until the year 1919, 1920, as we get to the 20th Amendment. But you have these Jim Crow laws. These loopholes to keep black men from voting. You have segregation, segregated towns and cities, segregated restaurants. Just because you now have freedom of slaves doesn't mean you have equality. And that's very important to remember here, in that freedom does not mean equality. And unfortunately, in the United States, it takes us another 100 years before we finally bring in equality to the freedom aspect of slavery. Just a horrible thing that's being done here to black men and women. So when Reconstruction is all said and done, which is going to be in 1876, Congressional Reconstruction officially ends in 1776. Now, it doesn't mean that the South is rebuilt in 1876. You're talking about 11 years since the Civil War has ended. The South is not rebuilt by any means. Economically, they're still in a really, really bad place. They're still in an economic depression. You still have towns and cities that are still destroyed. You still have farmland that's completely destroyed. Okay, so the South is not rebuilt in 1876. It's just that Congress gives up on it, and that's pretty much what it comes down to. Congress runs out of money, and they give up on Reconstruction of the South. And so in 1876, Congressional Reconstruction comes to an end, and that's going to be made official with the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 says that federal troops will leave Louisiana and South Carolina. Basically, federal troops will leave the South. They will be given money to build railroads, bridges, and etc. Southerners will be allowed to be in the presidential cabinet once again. And as a result, the Northerners leave. So this is a compromise in between the North and the South, to where Northerners are going to leave. Those 5 military districts headed by Union generals, they're now gone. And we begin to, in some ways, get more to a healing process to where Southerners are now able to be prominent members of government again. But in 1877, when Reconstruction comes to an end, the South is still not rebuilt. Again, it's going to take several decades before that happens. I'm talking 1920s, 30s, and 40s before the South fully recovers economically from the Civil War. And again, that's why you look at the cost of living in Alabama versus the cost of living in New York or Massachusetts. Now, again, in modern day, that's actually a good thing for us because it means that our homes don't cost as much. It means that our cars don't cost as much. And yet, on average, our average pay around here for careers is actually pretty high, especially since we live so close to Research Park in Huntsville and in Decatur. And so there are a lot of great job opportunities here in North Alabama, but yet at the same time, we have a very low cost of living. So that's actually a good thing. So I guess that we get the last laugh here, but it's going to take a long time before that happens. In the meantime, you have a good 50, 60, 70 years to where the South is just having to rebuild from the Civil War. So as Reconstruction comes to an end, and as we close up our talk here on chapter 12, the end of the Civil War is not the end of the devastation for the former Confederate States of America. Okay, the Civil War is over. You've lost your fight for independence. Now comes rebuilding economically and physically, and that doesn't fully happen for decades down the road. Again, which sets up our modern day United States. Again, it has a big impact on how we live these days. Okay, not only Alabama, but also Mississippi and Tennessee and Louisiana and Arkansas and Georgia. The cost of living in those states is, on average, much lower than living in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York. So, as Reconstruction comes to an end, it was not handled very good at all. It was all about politics. For Southerners, many Southerners are going to come out of Reconstruction with even more hatred and resentment for Northerners than what was before after the Civil War. And so Reconstruction, one of those times in our history to where it was just a really bad time period. It was all about politics. It was not handled very good at all. And the ones that are going to suffer are us here in the South. And if your families lived during that time period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, then they were the ones that were affected by this. Maybe your family came to the South in the last couple of decades, or maybe in the last couple of years. But if your family lived here 100 years ago, again, from the 1860s to about the 1930s, then your family was affected by this whole thing right here. Luckily, we have gotten past that today. Okay, so this is going to wrap up chapter 12. Next, we have chapter 13, which is going to deal. It's going to be our last chapter, dealing with life in the open West. I believe that we're really probably only going to have one video for chapter 13. Just a few things that I want to say about chapter 13, and we're going to finish up for the year. All right, so chapter 12 study guide is due on Monday, and I will see you guys for our meeting on Tuesday.